Lo, let us commence forthwith upon this protracted exegesis, an excoriation most vehement, wherein the fuliginous miasma of Christopher Nolan's autoristic inclinations is dissected with surgical asperity.
Writers, I'm sorry, I don't like Christopher Nolan that much. I know Interstellar, I know I know, but like, maybe it's not hack writers, maybe he's just right-wing. I hate this. I can't stand it when they're like, I want to make a villain out of a given political ideology. Here's what I'll do. Make a character, give them that ideology, and then make them randomly senselessly evil in a different way for no reason. Like, oh, Bane wants to challenge the wealthy, like Gotham Wall Street, who are like tearing the city apart and profiting from its poverty. Okay, that sounds sympathetic. Oh, now he wants to detonate a nuke and hold public executions. Oh, okay. Like, what the fi? Same with the Riddler in the newest one. Yeah. Literally. I get he was supposed to be like a shut-in incel mass shooter kind of vibe, and they did a really good job with that. I think Batman just like provokes a lot of fundamentally reactionary political takes, because you have the exact same thing with the Snyder comics, you know. But yeah, like Bane is literally like, what if I had a point, but then I was evil? And this was taking place, it was right after the Occupy Wall Street protests, where there were so many famous images coming out of people like outside Wall Street with their little encampments and like, you know, 99% versus 1% and so on and so forth. So like from all of that, if your takeaway is like, what if I made a villain who was like them, but then was super, super, super evil? And it's like, okay, great. Thank you. Hate that. Batman is still better than Superman. Disagree. In terms of like politics, disagree. People struggle to give a right-wing take on Superman, and the reason for that is because Superman is a good person. That's literally it. It is so difficult to make Superman a reactionary figure when his most defining trait is that he's a Boy Scout. Genuinely. Like, you can talk about the ethics of superheroism as much as you want, but it's almost impossible to give a conservative take on Superman when the main thing everyone knows about him is that he's really, really nice. You know, you kind of have to be like a bad person to be a conservative. I'm sorry. You have to at the very least be an edgy like thug, you know, engaging in vigilantism, beating up the poor or whatever. None of that tracks with Superman. It just doesn't, you know. You can make Superman eugenicsy, but people don't, is the thing, because then you have to take that one step further, right? Like, oh, Superman is better than people because of his like, you know, innate genetic superiority. Is he? Yes, he is. He literally objectively is. But he doesn't have that in his head. Like, he's an immigrant, and he, like, the whole point of his story is that he considers himself to be one of us. That's what makes him him. If you take that away, you're not even doing a Superman story. Like, that's an essential component of the dynamic, you know? He's supposed to be the perfectly idealized person? Not really. He's meant to be a golem. He was written by Jewish authors. He's meant to be like a protector, and I mean, he is, but he has to be a good person to be him. That's why I hate edgy Superman stories. You're not really like dissecting Superman at all. You're just writing edgy Superman. Like, Homelander isn't really a dissection of Superman. He's just a spoof character who wears the same colors. Nothing about Homelander applies to Superman, you know? Nothing transcribes over. There's no criticism of Superman as a character through Homelander, because Homelander's just like, what if a guy with Superman's power was evil? But Superman isn't evil. So, you know, you can consider that like a criticism, I guess, of like how superheroes might act if they really existed, but that's not the same as criticizing Superman. So you're not into injustice stories? Every single one of them that I've seen has been absolute dog shit. I'm sorry, if you want to do some sociology, if you want to get into like, well, what if the Justice League was evil, then go read The Authority, because they did that and better like 20 years ago. Does Superman have any personality flaw? Yeah, he's not God. He's just like personality-wise a regular guy. I mean, he's really good, but you know, whatever. It depends on the writer.
Verily, the chimerical concatenations of his cinematographic lexicon evince a pernicious dalliance with ideological bathos, a regurgitation of reactionary drivel, transmogrified into celluloid opulence and presented under the beguiling aegis of high-minded spectacle. To wit, the egregious caricature that he hath wrought in the figure of Bane, a simulacrum of radical egalitarian rhetoric, mutilated and sutured onto the corpus of cartoonish villainy. The Occupy Wall Street subtext, so flagrantly gesticulated towards yet simultaneously subverted into a grotesque chimera, reeks of the kind of discursive bad faith that could only be engendered in the fertile swamps of bourgeois paranoia. The very edifice of Gotham, that wretched hive of capitalistic excess, is presented not as an indictment of systemic iniquity, but as a fragile paradise besieged by the anarchic hordes of the rabble, an implicit endorsement of the Hobbesian dictum that the plebeian masses must forever be shackled beneath the paternalistic yoke of the propertied elite, lest they descend into primordial chaos. And what, pray tell, of his ostensible magnum opus, his peregrination into the cosmic sublime, Interstellar? A work that postures itself as a paean to scientific ingenuity, yet, upon closer scrutiny, reveals itself as little more than a lachrymose apologia for the rugged individualist mythos. The protagonist, an archetype of the libertarian Übermensch, is valorized not for his collective endeavor, not for his integration within the scientific community, but for his Promethean audacity to defy the very constraints of temporality itself. Behold, the Nietzschean cowboy, gallivanting across the galactic void, his every endeavor an anachronistic echo of manifest destiny transposed onto the astral plane. The collectivist ethos is relegated to the periphery, a mere afterthought amidst the lachrymose overtures of paternal devotion. Thus, Nolan's oeuvre is replete with a perfidious sleight of hand, wherein seemingly erudite inquiries into metaphysical quandaries and ethical paradoxes serve merely as a sugar-coated vessel for ideological contrivances that evince a deep-seated reactionary bent. His villains are not mere antagonists. They are avatars of the specters that haunt the reactionary imagination. Figures who, at first blush, may appear to articulate legitimate grievances, yet who are inevitably reduced to the status of unreasoning marauders. Chaos agents whose raison d'etre is rendered inexplicable save through the lens of inchoate malevolence. And yet, amidst this carnival of ideological chicanery, there arises the inevitable riposte. But what of Batman? What of that most vaunted paragon of vigilantist rectitude? To this, I respond with the acerbic invective that such an inquiry deserves. Batman, that perennial apologist for the status quo, is the archetypal bourgeois strongman, his very existence predicated upon the pathology of capitalist exceptionalism. He is the state's extrajudicial hand, a jackboot thug swaddled in the raiments of nobility, a brute who metes out his arbitrary justice in the dead of night, whilst the mechanisms of systemic oppression grind inexorably onward beneath the veneer of legitimacy. And lo, the same tired tropes are resurrected with the advent of the Batman, wherein the Riddler, presented as an incel-inflected denizen of the digital catacombs, is at first a figure whose grievances might be parsed as a critique of institutional rot, yet whose ultimate apotheosis is that of a nihilistic, bloodthirsty fiend. The specter of populist upheaval is thus safely neutered, reified into the familiar tropes of deranged lone wolves, their aspirations rendered illegitimate through the alchemy of authorial fiat. Contrapose this, if you dare, with the hagiographic depictions of Superman. Here is a character who, by virtue of his origins, is nigh impossible to transmogrify into the fodder of reactionary idolatry. His essence is one of unmitigated benevolence, a moral lodestar whose goodness is immutable, whose ethical compass is incorruptible. The very foundations of his mythos resist the attempts of conservative exegetes to appropriate him for their ends. For he is, at his core, the embodiment of an egalitarian ethos. The facile attempts to render him into a figure of eugenicist fantasy crumble beneath the weight of his narrative. His alienness is not one of supremacist exceptionalism, but of compassionate integration. And yet, the temptation to taint him with the grim dark malaise that so thoroughly infects contemporary interpretations of heroism persists. Enter the interminable parade of edgy Superman reinterpretations, those abortive endeavors that mistake cynicism for profundity, that supplant moral complexity with facile brutality. Homelander, a mere pantomime villain, a grotesque inversion that offers no substantive critique of Superman's ethos, but merely presents his powers as a vehicle for wanton cruelty. Injustice Superman, a laughable caricature, a dystopian fever dream that fails to grapple with the essential thematic pillars that render Superman who he is. Thus, one is left with the ineluctable conclusion: Nolan, in all his ostentatious grandiloquence, is merely the harbinger of a broader cultural malaise, an era wherein the superficial trappings of profundity are mistaken for depth, wherein the reactionary subtext is camouflaged beneath the gilded patina of aesthetic sophistication. His works, for all their pretensions of intellectual rigor, are little more than vessels for the anxieties of the ruling class, narratives that reaffirm the status quo beneath the illusory guise of interrogation. And so I say, with all the vehemence that this rant doth warrant, away with this charade, away with this insipid masquerade of profundity. Let us not be beguiled by the siren call of aestheticized reaction, nor by the obfuscated rhetoric of those who would dress the old myths of power and control in the raiments of innovation. For cinema, in its highest form, must not merely reflect the anxieties of the present. It must, at its best, challenge, subvert, and illuminate. And Nolan, for all his temporal pretensions and labyrinthine narratives, has done naught but erect a hall of mirrors, wherein the only image reflected back is that of the same old hegemonic dogma, polished anew for the delectation of the credulous.